quilting is rows of the straight stitch, and you can choose to place these rows close together, half an inch apart in this case, and an inch apart in this case. They can be vertical, horizontal, or diagonal across your project. This is a great technique for quilts, handbags, or any other type of project that you may be working on. So let's get started setting the machine up for channel quilting. The first thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you are on the straight stitch. And if you've moved to another stitch, you want to use that stitch selector dial on the right hand side of the machine. Next, we are going to place a decorative thread in the needle. The stitch, I think, shows up a little bit better with that decorative thread versus a standard sewing thread. Make sure that the needle is in that center position of 3.5 on the stitch width dial. And then we're going to change the stitch length to 3. Somewhere between 3 and 3.5 is ideal, and that's really also going to depend upon your thread weight too. I would say if your thread weight is a little heavier, maybe on the 28 or 12 weight side, you would want to go to a 4, but we're using a lighter weight thread, so we're going to stay at a 3 setting. For our first option, we're going to use our standard presser foot and the quilt guide that is part of the accessory package with the Jazz 2. This is actually inserted into the back side of the presser foot holder. You'll find a black guide, and the quilt guide slides into this position, and you can see that now it slides back and forth. This allows you to adjust your stitching either further or closer to the previous row. We're just going to set this off to the side as we establish our first row so that this doesn't get in the way while we're stitching. Now, as I'm stitching, I'm making sure that my needle is aligned with my marked line. If I find that my fabric seems to be pushing down towards the end of my project, I might want to look at adjusting my foot pressure. But so far, it seems to be okay using the standard presser foot. Clip those threads. Now, one other thing that we're going to do once we start our second row is we're going to engage our needle down and our needle stop down. I find that that works best when you're doing these types of techniques. But before we do that, let's adjust our quilt guide. I want my next row of stitching to be a ½ an inch on either side from my static or my main line. To adjust that, I'm going to use the markings on my bobbin cover plate and my needle plate. They're based off of that center needle position, or you can also use a ruler or a tape measure. So I'm in alignment, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to place that quilt guide on that last row of stitching. It's always on the last row of stitching that you created is where you're going to place this guide. Again, we're going to do needle down, and I want that needle to always stop in the down position, so I'm going to press that button to make sure that I have my green light and I know I'm ready to go. Now when I'm stitching, what I'm watching is the quilt guide on that stitching, not my needle and presser foot. They're always going to remain in the same spot. I really want to focus on that quilt guide. That way it ensures that the row that I'm stitching, or the row of stitching, is going to be in alignment with that first row and straight. Once you have one row that is not straight, the entire sequence will be the exact same way. We're going to come to the end. Take our needle out of our fabric. We're going to use a thread cutter, and we'll continue with our next row of stitching. What I also advise is that you always continually check to make sure that that distance is correct between your needle and your quilt guide. Sometimes I found in the past that I might have accidentally bumped the quilt guide, not realizing I had done so when I was taking a project out from underneath the presser foot. And then we'll continue to sew to the end. And I would just continue across my project with this same technique of, again, aligning that quilt guide with that last row of stitching. Needle out of the fabric, and again, we're going to clip those threads. And again, that needle down position is so important when you're working with these types of specialty techniques. To finish our project, we can continue creating rows of stitching across this fabric piece, actually adjusting the distance if we wanted to. We don't always necessarily have to stay at that same half-inch distance to complete that project. Now you're probably wondering, how do I do the other side? Because I want to add quilting to the other side. I simply turn my fabric around, and what I'm going to do, again, line that quilt guide up with that row of stitching, and then I'll just stitch down this piece, doing the same thing that I did on this side, creating my rows of that same straight stitch for my decorative accent to my project. Once we complete the end of this stitching, we're going to remove the quilt guide and we're going to change over to something that is called the walking foot. We're going to use the walking foot and the quilt guide for the next option. The walking foot is actually an optional accessory, but I think it's something that you really need to consider adding to what I call your arsenal of accessory feet. So let's remove that quilt guide. And then what we're going to do is we actually need to take off the presser foot. So we're going to use our screw and take off the presser foot and the presser foot holder. Now, when I put the quilt guide in, this is that little black guide that I was referencing of where that quilt guide is going to be positioned. To place the walking foot onto the presser foot, there's a couple of things that you're going to need to look at and make sure, be very conscious about when you're placing the walking foot in position. This little fork actually needs to go around your needle clamp. This little claw will actually go around that presser foot bar. What I always make sure is I unloosen the screw just a little bit, because this guide going around that bar is, it has to almost make a right hand turn, and I've made sure that that claw is around my needle clamp, and I'm going to come around and grab that around the needle bar, and you can see my clamp or the fork is around that needle clamp, and then what I call the claw is around that presser foot holder. I'm going to tighten that screw with my fingers, and then this is very important. Anytime you have something like this, like the walking foot or ruffling foot attached to a machine or any machine, because of the vibration of that foot moving up and down, you want to make sure that this screw is tight and in place. So always make sure that you use the screwdriver that came with your machine or that came with that accessory feet to make sure, or excuse me, accessory foot, to make sure that it is tight and in place. Now, in this instance, actually have all my rows of stitching marked. And I'm going to start on my first row using the walking foot. I'm leaving my settings the same, so my stitch length is still at that 3, my needle position is still at 3/5, and my foot pressure is still at 2. I have my needle always stopping in the down position. And what this does is, again, this prevents me from accidentally bumping my fabric as I've stopped stitching and something comes out of alignment. Now you can see my needle stopped down. This is that little fork or little claw that I was talking about that sits around that needle clamp. It is really important that that's in place. If it is not in place, you will hear a noise that might startle you for a moment. And the walking foot, the action of what the walking foot does will not work. And you can see what's happening with the walking foot if you've never used a walking foot. These little toes here, they come up and they move forward, and then they, in a sense, they're pushing that fabric, or they're moving that fabric as you're stitching. So as I get closer to the end, you can see how the walking foot really does assist in keeping those layers from shifting or, in a sense, sliding across one another. And by sliding across one another, what I would see per se is this top fabric might shift off towards the bottom. And an easy way too is to look at that back side. Now I can continue across, or I would continue across the fabric, continuing to stitch, but I might want a little bit of assistance with the walking foot as far as alignment. I'm going to use that same quilt guide, and on the back side of the walking foot, you'll notice there's a small hole, and that quilt guide will slide right into that position. And again, you can use the same method of the measurement of using the needle plate, but I also like to use the quilt guide on my marked line. That's my first row of stitching. So I can see I have to get my quilt guide a little closer. So what I do is, this is another method for alignment, I'm actually going to set this up so that my needle is in alignment with my fabric, or with my marked line, excuse me, and then I'm going to adjust my quilt guide so that it was on that last row of stitching. So now I know that I am perfectly aligned. I'm going to start to stitch. Now you're probably wondering, why are you doing that? Now there's going to be times where sometimes following a marked line, your eye doesn't always read it fully, or you might not have drawn it straight, or you're not necessarily seeing it straight. So if I have that quilt guide as my backup, if I can see that that quilt guide starts to go off of that last row of stitching, I can say to myself, okay, I need to pay attention to what is going on where my needle is. I need to adjust things a little bit. So I look at it as a backup. It's just a secondary way to look at how my rows of stitching are coming out. So as I come to the end, I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to start my next row of stitching. And what I would do is I would continue across my fabric piece doing the same exact thing of, again, aligning my needle with that marked line, and then aligning or making sure that my quilt guide is in the correct position so that it's on that last row of stitching. So this is how I would complete this piece. So you can see that the walking foot really is a great help when you are doing something like channel quilting or any other type of quilting.